talking about urgency reminds me of the next concept that we'll be discussing, buying influence modes, which really deals with how a buying influence feels about their particular situation and often denotes the timing of the sale. Modes sound like moods, and that's fine because the two are related. This is a very easy concept for most people to understand because every single person in sales has stories about customers being in the wrong mood or not being receptive to a brilliant presentation. Sometimes you're in the right room, but it's just the wrong day. No matter what you do, the customer is not in a buying mode. Heiman developed the concept of response modes to clarify what's going on in situations like this, to help salespeople identify more clearly when a customer will and will not be receptive to a sales proposal. Let's talk for a minute about what we mean by response mode.
Response modes are really the way in which an individual buying influence perceives or understands what you're proposing in relationship to his or her situation. In other words, we did not create response modes. They are in fact there. The biggest difficulty is that salespeople are so caught up in what they're saying in the presentation, the delivery, the sales pitch, that they tend to not be sensitive to the mode or mood of the individual they're addressing at that point in time. And what we want to do is to give you a shot at or a chance at understanding the response mode before you walk into the next face-to-face situation based upon the information that's available to you.
I think your comment about salespeople talking and talking and talking is a really good one because I think when they're talking, they're not understanding that the salesperson's perception of the situation isn't key. The thing that's really important is the customer's perception of the situation.
Yeah, I've often said that what you have to say in a sale is far less important than what the customer has to say, despite the fact that you have a lot of good stuff to present. And the reason is because you don't have any idea about how well what you're going to say will connect with that response mode that that individual is in. And the first one of these response modes is growth. And by growth, we are not talking about, I think this is really important, we're not talking about whether the customer is growing or not, or whether the department or function is growing or not. What we are really talking about is this particular specific individual buying influence and whether that person perceives your sale, your single sales objective, as a growth opportunity for him or her. All of the response modes relate to a discrepancy that exists or does not exist. By discrepancy, I mean simply where we are today versus where we want to be or where we think we should be. In growth mode, we're saying that where we are today is okay, but we have an opportunity to do much more or to do much better. And that gap between where we are and where we want to be is the growth mode, but it only exists in the mind of a specific buying influence. Even if you as the salesperson think there's a growth opportunity, it doesn't exist unless the buying influence sees that growth opportunity himself or herself.
And so as a salesperson, if I've identified that a customer perceives this particular situation as a growth situation, then the thing that I want to make clear that I do is show them how my proposal will take them to that higher level, will allow them to grow.
And that's exactly what you should do if the person is in a growth response mode. What's really important is that before you start talking about how you're going to help this person grow in this area, is that you understand that the person really is looking for that growth.
Then the second mode, which is very similar to growth but is actually the opposite end, is trouble. You're going along just fine, meeting your goals or what have you, and then the next thing you know, something happens and you find that you're not meeting those goals and you need to make some change right away.
Yes, in whatever area of the business you are attempting to sell into, there can be individuals who see an opportunity, maybe even in the same sales objective, who see an opportunity and they're therefore coming from a growth response mode, or another individual who sees that opportunity not as an opportunity, but as a problem for himself or herself. In other words, if we look at the gap, it is a negative gap. It is, I'm in trouble. I've got a fire I've got to put out. This is hurting. I have to take action now, or it's going to cost me my job, or it may cost me a bonus, or I may have to work late every night, or I won't be able to take a vacation, or whatever other kinds of things cause people to get anxious and panicky in a business situation.
I'm reminded of salespeople who have difficulty distinguishing between growth and trouble, and I had a situation at Miller Heiman that was very much the same way. We're growing very rapidly, and our telephone system is quite old. It doesn't accommodate that growth. And so the salespeople came in to present to me, and what they presented was growth. We can do this faster, we can record this, we can do the keep charge of long distance calls, you can accommodate so many more phones, and so on. What I wanted, though, because our system was so antiquated, was I had this incredible fear of waking up one morning and having the phones go down. And so there was only one salesperson who actually identified that, yes, I need to grow, therefore I need the system. But the real urgency was this thing was so old, the one that we have now, that I needed a solution right away.
And further, as I recall, the system had gone down a couple of times, and the panic that that caused and the concern about the impact on your customers was such that you felt it had to be fixed now. It wasn't something you could get to 6 months or a year from now.
Right. The phone company that we went with, though, was the one who had identified the urgency, the resolving of the problem, not the one who talked about the growth. They actually both can accommodate the growth, but the urgency was the issue, and it related to trouble.
I think that's really important in every selling situation, is to recognize even if the individual you're talking to, and remember this is a personal response mode, that each individual is coming from a different place, but even if the individual is looking at both growth and trouble, trouble always takes precedence over growth. In other words, you have to fix the problem first before they're going to listen to all the other wonderful things you can do that will enable them to grow.
So in these first two modes where you've got a gap, either you've got a customer who wants to grow and needs to move more, better, faster than what they are now, or you've got a customer that needs to bring themselves back up to reality because of a trouble, it's easy to understand that a buying influence will be receptive to change. My assumption is that in the other two modes, even keel and overconfident, there is no gap to address.
This is what's so critical about understanding these response modes. You really can't sell effectively to anyone who is not either looking for growth or trying to avoid future trouble or trying to fix a problem that they have right now. There, in each case, is a gap between where they perceive themselves today and what has to happen tomorrow. In the other two buying influence response modes, exactly as you said, there is no gap, and therefore you have a real tough time selling anything. The first one is even keel. And even keel is almost as self-explanatory as any phrase could be. But remember that even keel is the perception of the buying influence. It is not necessarily anybody else's reality.
And if there are multiple buying influences, it could be the perception of one buying influence, not the others.
That's correct. It could be one or two or none. But for the individual who is in even keel response mode, what that person is really saying, whether they're saying it out loud to you or to themselves, is why do I need to change anything when things are just fine the way they are?
So if a key buying influence is in even keel mode, really the only thing that you can do is just try and sell them on growth or trouble that you see coming.
You can try to do that, and you might succeed. There is also risk, because when you're telling someone who is perfectly comfortable with the way things are right now that they're wrong, because here's an opportunity for growth that they're not looking for, or here's a problem that they don't know they have, you may be asking these people to, at that point in time, to turn you off, to become defensive, or to perhaps not want you to come back again because they don't want you to mess around with what they're perfectly satisfied with today.
And if you have one buying influence in even keel and other buying influences in growth or trouble, my assumption is you could get those other buying influences to try and change the mode of the even keel buyer.
Yes, and particularly economic buying influence level people. If the person in even keel mode is at a lower level in the organization than senior level people in the user buying influence role, or senior level technical buying influences, or the economic buying influence, have a much better chance of changing that response mode from even keel to growth or trouble than you do. A far better chance than you do, particularly if one goes from even keel to trouble.
The fourth buying influence mode we call overconfident. Describe for me what overconfident mode means, Steve.
Sometimes people find difficulty in distinguishing between overconfident and even keel. And the reason that we distinguish between the two, because in both cases there's no gap. I suppose you could say there's a gap in overconfident, but it's a gap going the other way. It's a gap that says things are so much better than I ever expected them to be. I'd be a fool to change anything. The difference in degree is significant because it may be possible to move someone off of even keel. You may be able to do it with some risk, and other buying influences may be able to do it. Someone who is in overconfident mode is extremely difficult, or if not impossible, to change at this point in time right now. But one thing that's absolutely certain is that eventually someone who is overconfident, which means that they've got a false sense of reality, that they think things are a lot better than they really are, that person will at some point in time end up in trouble.
I'd like to make two comments. One is, I use this one myself when I'm trying to distinguish between even keel and overconfident. If the person will listen to what I have to say, I almost always think they're even keel. If they don't want to have anything, they don't want to listen to anything you have to say, anything new or different or what have you, then they're overconfident.
I think that's a very good test. In a sales situation, what will happen is they will keep changing the subject. They'll keep avoiding the issue because they don't want to talk about it at all.
The other thing I wanted to bring up was that overconfident, just like even keel, is a mode of an individual. So again, if you have multiple buying influences, the rest of them may not be in that mode, and your strategy can be to focus on having those buying influences change the buying influence in overconfident.
Yes, I think it's particularly important to recognize the pitfall or trap of talking about companies that are overconfident, companies that are even keel in growth or in trouble. When you start using those kinds of sentences or phrases, you really are not talking about this particular concept because it has nothing to do with companies. It is only an individual's perception of reality. In other words, a company could be in deep financial trouble, and individuals in that company could be coming from growth mode, and the reverse can be true. A company that's profitable and growing could have a situation where an individual is in real trouble in a particular function or department and therefore is coming from trouble mode.
Some people think that the best strategy when you have an even keel person or an overconfident person is just sitting around and waiting, because sooner or later they're going to cycle into either trouble or growth.
I'm not sure that sitting around is the best way to deal with it. I think the point is that one doesn't want to keep badgering an even keel individual. I think it's important to stay in regular contact, periodic contact, so that when the mode changes, you're the one that's there to deal with it.
Steve and I have just discussed the second and third key elements of the strategic selling process. We talked first about red flags, about how they should be considered positive, and about how in reducing their impact you could always rely on the principle of leverage from strength. Then we discussed the four buyer response modes: growth, trouble, even keel, and overconfident. And we explained why only the first two modes, growth and trouble, give you the results reality discrepancy that has to exist before a buying influence will be receptive to the change that you're proposing. We've said that the 4 response modes are personal, not corporate, and that you therefore always have to begin with the individual buying influence's perception of reality. The same principle applies with regard to the 4th key element of strategic selling, win results. At Miller Heiman, we say that results are corporate, but wins are personal, and that you've got